There are times when nothing happens for decades. But sometimes there are more things that happen in a few weeks than in a decade. In late 2001, as the United States invaded Afghanistan, resulting in a 20-year occupation, another crucial event passed almost unnoticed. At a conference in Doha, the World Trade Organization voted to accept China as a full member. With 1.3 billion people joining the world's largest economic organization, Beijing became the center of international trade. From then on, world trade started to change in China's favor. It gradually assumed the role of the leading trading partner of Asia, Africa, Europe, and South America. Chinese industry made the country a global factory, but China had to go through a traumatic process of economic experimentation to achieve such results. So, how did China do it? How did it evolve from a poor agrarian country into the industrial powerhouse we know today? Of all the resources available to mankind, perhaps the most expensive is time. For example, Napoleon slept only 4 hours a day. China's rapid growth is not an anomaly, but rather a throwback to the historical way things are. Back in 1800, the Qing Empire accounted for nearly a third of the world's GDP. The country had the same developed market economy as Europe. Silk, textiles, and ceramics were massively exported to European countries, resulting in an uneven trade surplus. Still, this was the maximum for China's vast population at the time. While the Industrial Revolution was underway in the West, the accumulated surpluses allowed the European empires to accelerate their colonial ambitions. This marked a disastrous situation for China. Since the Opium War of 1839, numerous foreign invasions had repeatedly devastated the country. First, the Chinese ports were opened to British steamships for the opium trade. Then, the Russian Empire annexed part of Manchuria, and by 1895, Japan had seized the Liaodong Peninsula and Taiwan. All along, a series of violent rebellions and civil wars threatened to split the state. Beijing's leadership realized that industrialization was essential for survival. But lacking a strong central government, the country was too large and self-sufficient to change its outdated policies. The modernization programs of the Qing dynasty failed. Even the nationalist government that replaced imperial rule proved incapable of dealing with the new challenges. The turbulence lasted until the Japanese troops were expelled from the mainland in 1945, followed by the Nationalist Party 4 years later. Once in the hands of the communist government, China finally succeeded in implementing nationwide reforms. However, China's political apparatus became distrustful of the outside world. The Beijing government, led by Mao Zedong, was convinced that only a highly centralized state with full control of the population could gain the resources needed to overcome the industrial backlog against foreign competitors. Communism, with its focus on state control, seemed to be the ideal option for China. There were some initial successes, including increased production, especially in the steel, coal, and petrochemical industries. However, while heavy industry prospered, agricultural production lagged. Amid the post-war baby boom and urbanization of the labor force, the inefficiency of the agricultural sector put enormous pressure on China's food security. It was clear something had to be done. Mao gave farmland to agrarian communities who were assigned grain quotas. Such a move was supposed to boost agricultural production, just as it had earlier boosted industrial production sector. Moreover, Mao divided the countryside into autonomous regional units in order to turn China's provinces into consumable state activities. This may sound strange now, but at the time, China suffered almost a 2-century-long ongoing conflict. As a military man, Mao developed economic policies based on the context of armed conflict. No wonder the plan completely failed. By 1959, the mismanagement of the economy and the reporting of grain production and the lack of motivation among private farmers led to the worst starvation in the history of mankind. Up to 50 million people died at that time, something beyond comprehension. Far from China's modernization, Mao's reckless policies wasted the country's potential. In the meantime, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan expanded their large manufacturing industries throughout the 1960s and 1970s. What went wrong with China, unlike its neighbors? It's all about worldview and belief system. As early as the middle of the 19th century, observing the fate of China in the hands of foreign powers, Japan adopted a Western approach to economics, science, and politics. This allowed it to increase its military potential, and within a few decades, the country reached the status of a great power. Resource-poor Japan expanded the empire by acquiring colonies in both Korea and Taiwan. although the peoples of these territories were severely repressed and resource extraction required Tokyo to make significant investments in the public activities of its colonies, including building highways, railroads, and ports. All three countries had established a pre-industrial base with export infrastructure by the time the Allies defeated Japan in 1945. The East Asian model formed a backbone for their success. In the post-war years, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan continued to develop their assets. Although each state had its own peculiarities, they followed a three-step system. The first step was land reform. By dividing large estates into small holdings, the East Asian states crushed the lobbying power of large agricultural enterprises. This promoted market competition, which in turn stimulated the growth of food production. The increased efficiency of the agricultural system triggered the mass migration of peasants to urban areas in search of work. Urbanization spread throughout the periphery. The second step was refocusing the economy on export production. Using the new urban workforce and existing export infrastructure, East Asian states became dominant in global industry, especially in consumer electronics. By focusing on exports, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan managed to launch the interstate exchanges necessary to accelerate technology transfer. In the third stage, each state adopted restrictive financial policies to direct capital to areas supported by the development strategy. Low interest rates returned cash flows to public investment, infrastructure, and corporate investment in industry, while control of capital flows prevented wealthy citizens from moving their money offshore. Low exchange rates made exports from East Asia even more competitive. Naturally, this policy was opposed by Western businesses. The fact that Asian companies had free access to the American market, while Asia was a closed zone for American companies, caused some damage to many businesses, as well as numerous thefts of intellectual property. Back then, America accepted this compromise because it needed strong, capable allies in Asia to counter communist influence. This also explains why Washington departed from its free trade principles and allowed its allies to develop the economy in a mercantilist way. The success of the East Asian states troubled Beijing in terms of power projection, so after Mao's death in 1976, his successor, Deng Xiaoping, took a different course. He revised the economic system and applied the three-step roadmap used by Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. China's secret weapon was its enormous scale, both territorial and demographic. Each province was as big as an entire country, which meant that Deng Xiaoping could conduct economic experiments at the local level before introducing them nationwide. For example, the Anhui province agricultural communes were divided into small plots, allowing local rural landowners to keep a surplus of grain. This incentive led to a surge in food production. Between 1978 and 1984, agricultural production increased by 1/3, while average farmer income more than doubled. Moreover, increased security of land ownership encouraged farmers to invest in capital goods such as tractors and other types of machinery. As the agricultural sector was mechanized, farming and local production grew steadily. In large cities, production processes were modified according to China's unique advantages. Unlike Mao, who prioritized heavy industry, Deng Xiaoping recognized that China's strength lay in its enormous labor force, making sense to use that workforce and focus on heavy industry later. Consequently, the priority was consumer goods manufacturing. Clothes, toys, and cosmetics. Made in China became a real trademark. Meanwhile, new factories sprang up, promoting urbanization. China's urban population grew from 190 million in 1980 to 300 million 10 years later. As Beijing gradually accumulated resources, certain restrictions on private business were loosened, making some state enterprises more competitive. Since the late 1970s, China has gradually become a global factory, but China's biggest challenge remained access to technology. Although Washington allowed Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to pursue a mercantilist economy without any restrictions, China had to offer U.S. business something in return. Beijing came up with something tempting. It allowed export-oriented companies to build factories in special economic zones along the coast, and then modernize the regional export infrastructure with ports, highways, and railroads. This combination of first-world infrastructure and cheap third-world labor proved to be indispensable to Western companies. As a result, foreign direct investment rose from zero in 1979 to $40 billion in 1997, reaching a peak of $290 billion in 2013. The World Factory status granted all sorts of privileges. Given such an influx of foreign currency into the country, Beijing could either procure the necessary technological capital or steal it as Western enterprises operated in Chinese territory. Anyway, after overcoming the technological gap, China's scale and natural advantage brought it to the forefront of world trade. From the outside, China's trial and error method and its ideological flexibility seemed overwhelming. Market Leninism appeared to contradict itself. Even after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, foreign analysts still expected that economic reform would be followed by political liberalization. This did not happen because, unlike Western doctrine, in China the government is not seen as an obstacle to economic prosperity, but as a prerequisite for it. For Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, being part of the American security umbrella meant making a social contract for democratic reforms. But in China, the Communist Party's preservation required that market reforms be accompanied by political repression. Despite the unusual character of this policy, its success is hard to deny. Between 1977 and 2019, real GDP, as measured by today's dollar value, rose from 150 billion to 14.3 trillion. That's mind-boggling growth. China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 reinforced its leading role in the global trading ecosystem. Its global factory status meant that China's dominance in international trade was only a matter of time. While in 2001, about two-thirds of the world's countries traded more actively with Washington than with Beijing, by 2018, things had changed exactly the opposite. Today, China is not only the world's factory, but also the world's leading trading partner. Exports as a means of economic growth have led the country to this result. But for further growth, China needs to develop its domestic markets. The next challenge for Beijing's leadership is a mature and highly developed economy. The Made in China 2025 plan, the Belt and Road Initiative, and attempts to build a Chinese Silicon Valley are all serving this purpose. While these programs may appear too insignificant, too small to transform China from within, the modernization programs of the 1970s confirm that sometimes reforms can be as dynamic as revolution. We're curious to hear your opinion about this video in the comments. At this point, we get to the end of our video. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon and give this video a big thumbs up.